The Korean War was the first battle of the Cold War and involved the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of North Korea and the pro-Western Republic of Southern Korea. The war began on June 25, 1950, and was initiated when the North Korean army illegally crossed the 38th parallel, the boundary between the two nations, in hopes of a surprise attack against South Korea. 5 days later, North Korean troops were able to seize Seoul, the capital of South Korea. South Korea soon asked the United Nations to intervene in hopes of putting an end to the war. However, when the decision came down to a vote, the Soviets were absent. Thus, the Soviet Union could not veto the UN's plan to send troops to Korea to stop the invasion. As a result, a total of 15 nations aided South Korea under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. The North Korean attack also shocked Harry Truman, the US president at the time, and he felt that it was his duty to defend South Korea, stating, "If we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another." Truman, like many others, feared that this attack was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world and that the North Koreans were trying to repeat what Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese had done in the 1930s. Thus, Truman readied his troops and prepared to help South Korea fight a war against the Northern troops and communism itself. By September of 1950, the North Koreans were able to advance and capture all of the Korean peninsula except for a tiny area around Busan, a small Korean city in the far southeast. Initially, the war went devastatingly for the Americans and South Koreans, who focused mainly on defending their territory and removing the communists out of South Korea. The North Koreans were well trained, healthy, disciplined, and supplied with proper equipment. The South Koreans, however, were terrified, confused, and seemed to focus more on leaving the battlefield at any chance possible rather than standing their ground and fighting for their country. To make matters worse, the war was during one of the hottest and driest summers. The excessive heat and aridity forced many desperately thirsty Americans to drink water from rice paddies that were fertilized with human waste. This caused many Americans to be diagnosed with serious intestinal diseases and illnesses. By the end of the summer, Truman and MacArthur launched a surprise attack against communist troops moving north from Busan. These soldiers were met with forces that had made an amphibious or naval landing at Incheon, a Korean city. The Incheon landing, commonly known as a pincer attack, successfully forced half the North Korean army to surrender and pushed the other half out of Seoul and back to their side of the 38th parallel. The American troops continued to pursue the North Koreans across the 38th parallel and pushed them to the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and Communist China. The Chinese, however, felt threatened by the mass number of American troops off their coast, calling it an armed aggression against Chinese territory. As a result, in October 1950, the Chinese leader Mao Zedong sent 300,000 troops into North Korea to support the communists and warned the United States to stray away from the Yalu River unless they wanted a war. Greatly outnumbering the Allies, the Chinese were able to push the American and South Korean troops out of North Korea and capture the capital of Seoul again. President Truman and his advisors clearly did not want to continue the war, as they felt that it would lead to the deployment of nuclear weapons and millions of senseless deaths. General MacArthur, however, refused to surrender and did everything in his power to provoke the war, even calling for a nuclear attack against China. In a letter he wrote to Joseph Martin, a House Republican leader who shared his beliefs, MacArthur declared that there is no substitute for victory against communism. Truman, however, viewed MacArthur's proposals as reckless and unnecessary, stating that they are trying to prevent a world war, not start one. In response, on April 11, Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
The war continued over the next 2 years. American and South Korean troops were able to drive the Chinese and North Koreans back. A year later, these troops were able to regain control of South Korea. During this 2-year period, both sides of the war were willing to accept a ceasefire that maintained the 30th parallel boundary, but were unable to agree on whether prisoners of the war should be returned to their homes. Finally, on July 27, 1953, the South Koreans were able to sign an armistice that allowed the prisoners of war to stay wherever they liked, produced a new boundary near the 30th parallel that gave South Korea an additional 1,500 square miles of territory, and created a 2-mile wide demilitarized zone, still used today to divide the two countries. After 3 long, brutal years of battle, the Korean War finally came to an end. Nearly 5 million people died in all during the war. More than half of these casualties were civilians, making the rate of civilian casualties in the Korean War higher than the rates of World War II and the Vietnam War. 10% of the civilian casualties were pre-war Koreans, more than 40,000 of the total deaths were Americans, and about 100,000 more Americans were wounded. Following the end of the Korean War, the communist dictator Kim Sung-II established farms, developed a successful industry, and strengthened the North Korean army. After Sung's death, his son developed nuclear weapons that caused serious economic problems with other countries. On the other hand, South Korea's economy and society prospered due to the massive aid provided from the United States and other countries from the UN. South Korea concentrated on developing its industry and expanding its foreign trade, and was able to establish free elections by 1987. During the 1980s and 1990s, South Korea had one of the highest economic growth rates in the world. Although the Korean War was a devastating battle that marked the start of the Cold War, it will forever be remembered and honored as a war that boosted South Korea's economic success and strengthened our relationship with them.